There's an entire generation of people who can remember the sound of a dial-up modem and also helped beta test Instagram, and developmental psychologists are still trying to figure out what that did to their brains. If you were born between 1976 and 1985, you don't quite fit with Gen X, even though you share some of their cynicism, and you're definitely not a millennial. Despite what every think piece keeps insisting, you're what sociologists started calling a Xennial around 2014, sometimes spelled with a Z, sometimes with an X, and some researchers have even labeled this a microgeneration because the birth window is so narrow and so specific. But what happened during that particular slice of history created something that's genuinely worth examining from a psychological standpoint. The timing of when you grew up, and more importantly, when you entered adulthood, created a set of cognitive patterns and emotional frameworks that don't exist in quite the same way for anyone born before or after. So today we're going to explore what makes Xennials interesting, not as a cultural curiosity, but as a case study in how rapid technological and economic change shapes human psychology. From the very beginning, your childhood existed in a completely analog world. You spent hours lying on the carpet with the phone cord stretched across the hallway, talking to friends while staring at the ceiling. You recorded songs off the radio onto cassette tapes, hitting pause and record at exactly the right moment. You had to actually be home to receive a phone call, and if you missed it, you might never know who called. Plans were made days in advance because there was no way to communicate a last-minute change. If you were meeting someone at the mall at 3 p.m., you showed up at 3 p.m. and you waited because that's what the plan was. Not gradually, over a decade of incremental updates, but suddenly, right as you were in your early 20s in your first jobs, in your first serious relationships, the entire infrastructure of human communication was rebuilt. The timing of this shift had consequences that are still playing out in how Xennials process information, form relationships, and navigate uncertainty. Most generations grow up entirely within one technological paradigm. Baby boomers spent their formative years in a world of 3 TV channels and rotary phones, and they were already in their 40s or 50s when the internet became mainstream. Millennials, especially those born after 1988, have vague childhood memories of VHS tapes, but their adolescence and identity formation happen almost entirely in a connected world. Xennials, however, experience both paradigms during what developmental psychology calls emerging adulthood, that critical period between ages 18 and 25 when you're forming your core identity, your working models of relationships, and your fundamental beliefs about how the world operates. Your teens looked radically different from your 20s, and the gap between those experiences was far wider than what most generations encounter. According to research on neuroplasticity published in Nature Neuroscience, the prefrontal cortex, the brain region responsible for executive function, decision-making, and adapting to new social environments, continues developing until approximately age 25. This means Xennials were still in this critical window of neural flexibility when the technological landscape underwent a complete transformation. You were young enough that learning new platforms felt natural and intuitive, but old enough to have fully formed memories and habits from before. A 2019 study in developmental psychology found that experiences during emerging adulthood have an outsized impact on long-term cognitive patterns, precisely because the brain is still consolidating its adult architecture during this period. You weren't just learning to use new tools. You were integrating 2 completely different models of how human connection and information flow work, and you were doing it while your brain was still finalizing how it processes social interaction and manages attention. This created what psychologists might call a cognitive bilingualism. Think about what actual bilingualism does to the brain. Research from Penn State shows that people who speak multiple languages develop enhanced executive control because they're constantly switching between different systems of meaning and grammar. Xennials develop something similar, but for technology and social behavior. You can sit in a meeting without compulsively checking your phone, but you also don't feel intimidated when someone introduces a new collaboration platform. You remember what it felt like to be genuinely unreachable for 8 hours while you were at school or work, which is an experience many younger people have literally never had. But you're also not bewildered by social media the way some older generations are, and this shows up in surprisingly specific ways. Research on techno-stress, the anxiety and cognitive load created by technology use, shows that different age groups experience it very differently. A study in computers and human behavior found that older adults often experience stress from learning new technology, while younger adults experience stress from the constant connectivity itself. Xennials tend to report lower levels of both. You have what researchers call technological self-efficacy, confidence in your ability to master new systems. But you also have a built-in kill switch. You know how to unplug because you remember that unplugged was just the default state of existence for the first 20 years of your life. Your relationship with privacy is fundamentally different from both older and younger generations, and this has real psychological implications. You grew up in a world where your embarrassing moments, your bad decisions, your awkward phases just faded. That time you got dumped at homecoming. That regrettable haircut. That party where you made out with your friend's ex. These things existed only in human memory, which meant they could evolve, could become funny stories, could be reinterpreted or forgotten entirely. There's no digital record, no tagged photos, no comment section preserving the cruelty of teenage social dynamics forever. This created what psychologists call redemptive narratives, the ability to reframe and reinterpret your past as you grow. Research on autobiographical memory from the University of California shows that human memory is designed to be reconstructive, not archival. We're supposed to edit our memories, keep what's meaningful, let the rest blur. When everything is documented and searchable, that natural psychological process gets interrupted in ways we're still trying to understand. A 2021 study in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that people with extensive digital records of their past showed different patterns in how they construct their life. Narratives, there's less interpretation, less personal growth in the storytelling because the facts are always there to contradict your evolved understanding. But Xennials got to have both experiences. Your childhood and adolescence were private in a way that no longer exists, but your adulthood has been documented. You know what it's like to have your past be truly past, which might be why research suggests Xennials report lower levels of social media anxiety than younger millennials despite using the same platforms. But here's where things get messy. You entered the job market during the 2008 financial crisis or in the years immediately following it, which means you experienced significant economic disruption during the exact life stage when you were supposed to be establishing financial security and career trajectory. That timing matters more than most people realize. Economic research from the Federal Reserve shows that people who enter the workforce during a recession earn less over their entire lifetime, not just in those first few years. But the psychological effects go even deeper. Research published in the Journal of Economic Psychology found that experiencing financial instability during emerging adulthood creates lasting changes in risk tolerance, saving behavior, and fundamental beliefs about economic security. You watched people with degrees and experience lose their jobs. You saw the work hard and you'll succeed narrative completely fall apart. Many Xennials spent their mid-20s or underemployed, taking jobs they were overqualified for, moving back in with parents, watching the American dream get downsized in real time. So you got this generation that learned to adapt to massive technological change because you had no choice, but you also got economically burned right when you were trying to build stability. You developed flexibility and resilience because you had to, but you might also carry this low-frequency anxiety, this background hum of what if it all falls apart again that runs through your decision-making even now. And nobody really addresses this combination, the way economic trauma and technological fluency coexist in the Xennial psychology. The cultural conversation about generations tends to be reductive, pitting Gen X against Millennials as if everyone born between 1965 and 2000 is basically the same, with slightly different music preferences. But the specific years matter, especially during periods of rapid change. The media narrative frames Gen X as cynical slackers and Millennials as entitled narcissists, and Xennials get lumped into whichever stereotype is more convenient for the argument being made. But the Xennial experience doesn't fit either framework. You came of age during a transition period that was so compressed, so rapid, that it created genuinely distinct psychological patterns. A Pew Research analysis of generational definitions notes that the endpoints of generations are often fuzzy and contested, but they acknowledge that cuspers, people born at the boundaries, often report feeling like they don't fully belong to either group. What makes Xennials different is that they're not just on the cusp between two stable generations. They lived through the cusp between two entire paradigms of human existence. The person you were at 15 and the person you became at 25 grew up in what might as well have been different civilizations. Xennials embody a paradox that's actually pretty unusual in generational psychology. You have the independence and self-reliance of Gen X because you grew up before helicopter parenting became standard. Your parents probably didn't know where you were for hours at a time, and that was normal. You biked to your friend's house and stayed there all day. You solved your own problems, entertained yourself through boredom, dealt with social conflict without adult mediation. Research on the development of executive function shows that children who spend time in unstructured, unsupervised play develop better problem-solving skills and emotional regulation. You got that. But you also came of age during the early optimism of the internet era, before we all realized that maybe constant connectivity was making things more complicated rather than simpler. You were in your 20s when social media was supposed to bring people together, before we understood the mental health implications. So you're independent, but you're also collaborative. You're skeptical, but you're also open to possibility. You're comfortable with analog patience, but you're fluent in digital immediacy. And this isn't cognitive dissonance. This is integration. What seems to define the Xennial psychology is this ability to hold contradictions without needing to resolve them. You remember the before and the after, which means you can see both what was gained and what was lost with unusual clarity. You're not as nostalgic as Gen X because you genuinely appreciate modern conveniences. You're not sitting around wishing we could go back to MapQuest and arguing about facts with no way to look them up. But unlike younger generations, you can articulate exactly what we gave up. You lost the ability to be truly alone with your thoughts without it being a deliberate choice. You lost the patience that comes from having to wait for photos to be developed, for letters to arrive, for that song to come on the radio again. You lost a certain quality of presence that existed when there wasn't always something else, somewhere else, someone else competing for your attention. Research on attention and mindfulness from the Greater Good Science Center suggests that the constant availability of distraction literally changes how the brain processes focus and boredom. But you remember what it was like before. You have a baseline for comparison. At the same time, you gain connection across distance, access to information and communities and possibilities your younger self couldn't have imagined. You can work remotely, maintain friendships across continents, learn anything from anyone at any time. The Xennial experience is valuable not because you have some superior wisdom, but because you're living proof that humans can adapt to massive change without completely losing their core identity. If you're a Xennial, you probably feel like you don't quite fit anywhere. Too young for some references, too old for others. You remember 9/11 as an adult, but you also know all the words to TikTok songs. You own property, but you also have student loan debt. You got on Facebook when you still needed a DUZ email address, which means you watched it transform from a college directory into whatever it is now. And that feeling of not fitting, that's not a bug. That's the defining feature. In a world that's changing faster than anyone can predict, having lived through one massive, compressed transition might be one of the most valuable educations you could have received. You learned that the world you grew up in doesn't have to be the world you live in forever. That adaptability isn't about abandoning who you are. It's about integrating new realities without losing your foundation. Developmental psychologist Jeffrey Arnett's research on emerging adulthood emphasizes that the experiences during this period create what he calls identity capital, the resources and frameworks you carry forward into the rest of your life. For Xennials, that capital includes a rare kind of flexibility. You know change is possible because you lived through it. You know stability is valuable because you remember when things were slower. You can code switch between analog and digital, between skepticism and optimism, between independence and collaboration, in ways that are genuinely useful in a world that keeps demanding both and thinking instead of either or. The Xennial experience matters beyond just understanding this particular age cohort. It's a preview of what happens to human psychology during periods of rapid change. We're living through another massive transition right now: AI, climate crisis, geopolitical restructuring, and the next microgeneration is being shaped by that transition, just like Xennials were shaped by the digital revolution. Understanding how Xennials adapted, what psychological patterns emerged, what got lost and what got gained, gives us a framework for thinking about how all of us navigate transformation. You're not special in some superior way, but you lived through a specific moment in history that taught you something the rest of us are still figuring out: how to change without fracturing, how to adapt without forgetting, how to build a coherent self when the world keeps rewriting the rules. If this resonated with you, I'd really appreciate you subscribing. And if you want to help me keep making content like this, consider becoming a channel member. Your support genuinely means a lot. I've got some other videos exploring different psychological phenomena that I think you'll connect with. Same depth, different angles. I'll see you in the next one.